what I wanted to do is I wanted to spend just a few minutes thinking about just kind of observing some repeated disappointing behavior of the apostles in a couple of occasions. And I want to look at that not because I want to throw stones at the apostles, because I really want us to sort of recognize ourselves in the apostles. But I want us to learn from some of their mistakes. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about some of these things that we come across as we are looking at the life of Christ. So, for example, we'll start out in Luke chapter 9, and we'll notice that in verse 51, Luke chapter 9 and verse 51, the text says, Luke tells us that when the days were approaching for his ascension, that is for Jesus' reference to his death, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. Some of the versions say that he set his heart, or he resolved to go to Jerusalem. If we're looking at this from a time perspective, it's kind of interesting, because one of the things we see in all the Gospels is when we start with the life of Christ, we start getting some information. But as we get toward the end of his life, we get more and more information. So much so that in Luke chapter 9 and verse 51, we're actually at the 6th month mark before Jesus dies. So Luke chapter 9 verse 51 is kind of a marker for us that helps us recognize we're just 6 months away from actually being at the cross. We're not even halfway through the longest and most comprehensive of the Gospels, which is Luke. We're not even halfway through that gospel when we get to this point. And again, that says to us that it's the end of Jesus' life that is the really important part of his life. And that's why we get more details as we get closer to the end of his life. But Jesus has now reached a point in his ministry where he is determined, he has made up his mind that he is not going to be deterred from accomplishing his mission, that he is definitely going to go to Jerusalem and die on the cross. And not that that was ever really in question, but the point is he sort of sets his heart, as it were, to do this thing that is very, very difficult. He doesn't go to Jerusalem directly. He spends 6 months getting there, but he ultimately does. And so when we go through the book of Luke, we'll find in a number of places, like Luke 13 and verse 22, and Luke 19 and verse 28, we'll find expressions that tell us he's still going toward Jerusalem. He's moving toward this impending event. And what we're seeing as we begin to look at some of the texts around Luke 9 and in the other Gospels as well, the same period of time and following, we're going to see that things are getting more and more serious. And Jesus is getting more and more serious. And he's getting more and more plain, especially with his disciples, about what's ahead of him. He knows what's ahead of him. He knows what's coming. The cross is coming. He knows that. And he wants his disciples to know that and to understand that. And I just want to show you some things that happen as those kinds of things are occurring. So, Luke 9 and verse 51, we're 6 months out from the death of Jesus. And if we go to Mark's account, in Mark chapter 9, and so just go with me to Mark's account, Mark chapter 9, we'll notice that the transfiguration is talked about. We see that in Mark chapter 9, verse 2, the transfiguration. And it's 6 days later that Peter and James are talking to this 6 days later than the events that occurred just previous to that. And so what it is that 6 months or 6 days before the transfiguration of Jesus comes to a place called Caesarea Philippi, and at this point his ministry reaches a very pivotal point. In Mark chapter 8, and if we back up to that 6 day, what happened 6 days before the transfiguration, we find he's coming to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, that area, and on the way he's discussing things with his disciples, and he says to them, he asks them a question, who do people say that I am? Who are people saying that I am? And they're saying, some people say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah or one of the other prophets, all of which were good things to say about Jesus. Okay, those were all great men of faith, John the Baptist, Elijah, and the prophets. But he continued and he said to them, but who do you say that I am? And it is on this occasion that Peter answered and said, you are the Christ. Matthew's more full account says, that Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And so this confession on the part of Peter, which I think he's speaking for all of the 12, he's saying, we believe that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And the fact that they are convinced of this point, I believe, brings Jesus to a point where he's ready to sort of make a change or sort of pivot his ministry and aim it more directly at ultimately going to the cross. I want you to see that it says that Jesus begins to talk about, and he warned them and to tell no one about this, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly, okay? I want you to notice that Jesus tells the apostles at this point, he decides now to make it clear to them of what's happening. I'm getting ready to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be crucified, buried, and rise again on the third day. Matthew actually, in his account in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 1, he stresses this idea by saying that from this time, Jesus began to talk about this. So the point is, Jesus has been alluding to what's going on in the future, what's going to ultimately happen, that he's ultimately going to the cross, but he's not been very clear about it until this point. At this point, when the disciples are convinced that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus begins to make a more direct and more conscientious effort to make them aware of what that involved, that he was actually going to the cross to be crucified. And the text says that he was stating this thing plainly, so they should have gotten it. But they didn't. They didn't get it. And in fact, Peter, who had just confessed, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," he even rebukes Jesus on this occasion. He says, "This will never happen to you." Mark doesn't tell us that, just tells us that he rebuked Jesus. But Matthew tells us that he said, "No, it will never happen to you." And Jesus' words are, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." He actually says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." That's as if to say, you're acting in the devil's place, get out of my way. And that's because I would suggest to you that when Jesus is talking about the upcoming events of the cross, and his disciples say, that will never be, that was in fact a form of strong temptation for Jesus. Peter didn't recognize that in saying what he was saying, he was actually tempting Jesus to abort his mission. You don't have to go to the cross. That'll never happen to you. That's not going to happen. The point is that they don't get it. They don't understand what's going on. Well, 6 days later, continue in Mark's account, we find out that sure enough, there is the transfiguration that happens in Mark chapter 9 and verse 2. And soon after that, Jesus is in Galilee, and again, he talks to his disciples in Mark chapter 9, notice verse 30, beginning at verse 30. From there he went out, this is Mark 9, verse 30. From there he went out and began to go through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know about it. And he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. Notice that Jesus is very plain again about what's going to happen. I'm going to be delivered over to men. I'm going to be killed, and then 3 days after I'm dead, I'm going to come alive again. The text says, but they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. What is really sort of interesting, not really interesting, it's a little disappointing, it's a little odd, it's a little mystifying, is that instead of asking Jesus, what do you mean by this? What do you mean you're going to the cross? Instead of that, what they ended up doing was they ended up discussing among themselves who was the greatest. Because in verse 33, they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he began to question them. What were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. Luke's account says they actually argued about it. An argument broke out among them about which one of them was the greatest. And so when Jesus asked them, what were you talking about? They didn't talk. They didn't say anything. They recognized that their discussion on the way was rather inappropriate. It was not the right thing to talk about. And we think, yeah, the master is talking to you about his upcoming death, his impending death, and you guys are bickering about which one of you is the greatest. We almost want to go, wow. That's kind of insensitive on their part. That's kind of blind on their part. And so you kind of think, why aren't they getting the message? And what's so interesting about that is that instead of getting disgusted with them, instead of, just reading them a right act about, aren't you guys paying attention? Jesus patiently teaches them about childlike humility and the kind of humility that you and I need to have as servants of the Lord. Later, when we get to Mark chapter 10, and verse 32, Jesus is still going up to Jerusalem, and he's walking on ahead of them, and they are amazed. This is Mark 10 and verse 32. They're amazed, and those who followed were fearful. And so, as he's going, there's something about his determination, there's something about what's going on here that is a little amazing to these guys. They're a little wonderstruck about it. They don't quite grasp what's happening. There's sort of a sense of dread because they're kind of afraid. They don't really know what is going on and what's happening. And the text says he again took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again. And now for the third time then in Mark's account of the life of Christ, in this very short period of time, as Jesus is working his way to Jerusalem, for the third time, he tells the disciples in clear language that he's going to be delivered up to the chief priests. He's going to be condemned to death. He will be executed by crucifixion. And ultimately, though, he will rise from the dead 3 days after his death. That's serious stuff. That's a serious thing. That's a major thing that Jesus is talking about and doing. And he's just told them about it now for the third time. And look what happens, what the very next text is about. Verse 38, or verse 35. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus saying, Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask of you. Jesus says to them, what do you want me to do for you? Listen to what they want. They said to him, grant that we may sit one on your right hand and one on your left in your glory. Jesus has again told them about the seriousness of his future and how it's going to end in his death, but then his resurrection. And what they're thinking about, James and John are thinking about, is this thing that they've been talking about before. Who's the greatest? And they actually now are trying to get Jesus to commit to making them one on the right and one on the left. They wanted the top spots. Jesus says to them, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And here's an indication again that they still don't get it because they actually say, we are able. We're able. And Jesus says to them, the cup that I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, this is not mine to give, but is for those for whom it has been prepared. Then I want you to notice what we're told in the next verse. Because the next verse says, hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. So much so that Jesus has to talk to them about what greatness and leadership in the kingdom, in his coming kingdom, is really all about. And that's where Jesus teaches the great things about leadership that we need to understand. But what I want you to understand, what I want you to see, is as James and John are jockeying for place and position in the kingdom, the other disciples, their response to when they find out that that's what James and John are asking, their response puts them in exactly the same place because they're indignant. They're upset at James and John because they beat them. You guys asked before we could ask. And they're upset about that. The Lord is headed to death. He's been plain and clear about he's headed to his death. An awful way, execution by crucifixion. And they're talking about who's greatest, who's going to be the greatest. And guys, it doesn't get better because even the night in which Jesus was betrayed, if we go to Luke's account in Luke chapter 22, after Jesus had given them the Lord's Supper, that which we just ate a moment ago, something to remember his death and burial, his death and his blood and body given for them. In the 22nd chapter of Luke, beginning at verse 19, Jesus had talked a little bit about the one who was going to betray him. And after he gives them the Lord's Supper, and in verse 24, and there arose a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be the greatest. You understand that in just a few hours, maybe, Jesus will be arrested. The thing that he had been telling them about that was going to happen was on the very precipice of happening. It was going to happen the way they counted time later that very day, because it was evening and then the next day he would be put on the cross. That would be Friday to us, but to them it would be a continuation of the previous day. He was going to be on the cross, and before the next evening he would be in the tomb. And they're arguing about greatness. Who's the greatest of us? What is going on here? These men should have been focused on what Jesus was saying to them, on what he was teaching them. That should have been what they were listening to and thinking about and focused on, and especially so in view of how serious the message was that he was trying to teach them and share with them. That should have been what they thought about. And yet they were distracted by something else. They were distracted they were distracted from that important, critically important thing to something that was very self-serving, in some ways quite carnal, because they were looking for position and place and greatness. And we ask ourselves, how can they be so insensitive? How could they have been so carnally minded, so self-serving? I think one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to be careful, though, because, first of all, we're looking at the events we've seen. We look back on the events, so we know what Jesus is going to have to suffer. We know that he goes to the cross. We see that. We read the accounts of that, and we see his resurrection. We know what's coming after. And so it's easy for us, because we weren't standing where they stood, it's easier because we're looking at it after the fact. It's easy for us to say, they should have been paying more attention. But they weren't. Their heads were in the clouds. They were thinking about position and place. They knew a coming kingdom. The king was going to start his reign very soon. And they wanted the top spots. They wanted position. We have trouble understanding how they could do that, how they could miss that. But the reality is, we look at the apostles, and it's not just in this issue. Very often when the disciples did dumb things, it's very easy for us to see their faults. It's so obvious to us. Their flaw is so glaring, so obvious, and we wonder how they couldn't see what they should have been seeing. But if we can see it so easily for them, if it's so very obvious to us, why can't they see it themselves? How can they be that blind? The reason is the apostles were human like you and me. And we humans tend to get distracted by shiny things. We get distracted by things that are of lesser importance, but seem to be really important to us. And I want us to be careful then and learn from this, because I want us to be where we have to be careful when we find fault with the disciples. When we start belittling their silly flaws. Why did they do that silly thing? Why do we need to be careful about that? Frankly, folks, because we're just like them. If we're really honest with ourselves, and we're really honest as we look at the apostles, and we look at their flaws, even their flaw in regard to this matter, glaring as it was, we ourselves are just like them. We see ourselves in them, really, if we're honest. If they could be so blind to their fault, if they could be so insensitive to what Jesus was trying to teach them, can't we? Can't we be that blind too? I would suggest that we can be, and I would suggest that so often we are. It's not about the same thing. It's not the same shiny thing that attracts our attention. But it is very often the shiny thing that gets us distracted from what we ought to be seeing. They were distracted because they weren't looking at things from God's perspective. They weren't looking at things from an eternal perspective. They were looking at things from a temporal perspective. And that brings me really to the main message that I want to share with you today. And that is that we as disciples of Jesus have got to keep our focus on the eternal. We cannot allow ourselves to get distracted by the earthly. And folks, it's just real easy for us to do that. And if we'd all just stop a minute and think about what it is that we often give most of our time to, most of our energy to, we'll see that it's maybe not the eternal things, but it is the temporal things. Go with me to that passage that I graciously let Ron read this time. I feel so bad once so recently last time I think it was, it's been a long time since I've been in the pulpit for reasons beyond my control. But anyway, the last time I got up to preach before he got to read the scripture reading. So I'm sorry about that, Ron. So I made up for it today. We got to read it today. In 2 Corinthians, if you'll go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul talks about the way we think. That is the way we're supposed to think as disciples of Jesus. Even when we're struggling, even when there are things in the way, even when there are problems that we have to deal with on this earth, even in those times when it's so easy to be distracted by this earthly problem that we're having to deal with, even at those times, we're not to be so focused on the earthly thing. The disciples of Jesus have a different mindset. Listen, folks, I'm not talking about how religious folks in the world think. I'm talking about us. I'm talking about those of us who want to be authentic disciples of Jesus. Here's the way we're supposed to think. Therefore, we do not lose heart when struggles come. But though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary, I think about that passage, guys. I'm getting to an age where I don't do what I used to be able to do. I just hit 67 when I got to Africa on the 2nd day of April. Landed there, turned 67. You understand that's only 3 years from being 70? When I was a kid and I looked at somebody who was 70, I thought, man, that guy's old. In fact, when I saw somebody who was 65 and I'm 67, I thought, man, that guy, he's on Medicare. And I see the outward man decaying. And I get with some of the guys here, and I love the guys here. And maybe 3 or 4 of us are standing around and we got to pick up something big and heavy. And the guys will go, oh, we'll need to wait until we can get 4 guys. It's going to take 4 guys to carry this. And I'm going, hang on a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, no, Mr. Rick, we couldn't let you pick it up. They think I'm too old. And I love them for it. Because the truth of the matter is, if I squatted over and tried to pick it up, it might not be very pretty. And the reality is, I'm realizing that my outer man is clearly decaying. Okay? I'm still drop dead handsome, but I'm still pretty muscular, but outer man, and that Paul is drawing attention to that fact. He says, therefore we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, the inner man, the spiritual man, is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond comparison, while we listen now, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things that are seen are temporal, but the things that are not seen are eternal. Our eyes are supposed to be focused not on what we can see with our physical eyes. That's temporal. What we're supposed to be focused on is that which cannot be seen with the physical eye, but must be seen with the eye of faith. That is the thing that is eternal. And that is where our focus is supposed to be. And not on all the things that are going on that are physical. Paul goes on with this when he talks about the fact that our earthly tent, for we know that if the earthly tent which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. This temporal body will one day be transformed into something that's not temporal anymore, but that is eternal. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, inasmuch as we, having put it on, will not be found naked. Listen how we're supposed to be thinking, folks. We're supposed to be groaning. That's right, groaning for that eternal body. We're supposed to be not just saying, I'd like to go to heaven one day. That's what we're supposed to be wanting. But I want to get a college degree. I want to make it big in business. I want to win the next whatever, championship or whatever. That's what I want. And those things are taking our focus away from what we're supposed to be groaning for, is the eternal. I'm not blind to the fact that we have to deal with earthly things right now. But we can't let those things become so much the focus of our lives that they become the focus of our life. And they take our eye off of that which is eternal. He says, for indeed, while we are in this tent, we groan, being burdened because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now he who prepared for this very purpose is God, who gave us the Spirit as a pledge. Therefore, being always of good courage, and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith and not by sight. We are of good courage, I say, and I prefer rather to be absent from the body, but to be home with the Lord. Is that really the ambition of your life? Would you really rather go be with the Lord? So glad that my father, just about making it to 93 years old, has finally put off that shell of a body he was living in and has gone to be with the Lord. That's what he always wanted. That's what needs to be what we always want. He says, therefore we also have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing God. The thing the focus of my life, the fact that I want to be with my Lord in eternity, is the thing that helps me keep making sure that whatever I'm doing here on this earth, it is a walk of faith that seeks to please him in every way. So I'm not just seeking to pursue right hand or left hand of the kingdom, honor and great wealth or position and power, or some earthly thing that I think is going to make my life comfortable and better. What I'm pursuing, because what we're supposed to be focusing on is being with the Lord. That's what we really want. That affects the way that we look at these earthly lives. We keep them in perspective. And we deal with them as we need to deal with them, but we don't let them remove or get our focus off of that which is eternal. Guys, this is a biblical principle over and over stated. Look at Philippians chapter 3. You remember Paul's words, Philippians chapter 3. He says, not that I have already obtained it, speaking of the eternal reward, not that I have already attained it or have already become perfect, but I press on so that I may lay hold of that for which I was laid hold of by Christ Jesus. Brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do. Notice the singleness of purpose there. One thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God. Look at verse 20 and 21. For our citizenship is in heaven, from which also we eagerly wait for a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform the body of our humble state into conformity with the body of his glory by the exertion of the power with which he has even subjected all things to himself. Our reward, our citizenship is in heaven. Proud to be an American, but I'll tell you something. Though I have an American citizenship, and though I use my American passport in ways that allows me to take the gospel to other places, and I'm grateful for that citizenship, my citizenship is not really here. Our citizenship is in heaven. That's what Paul says. Colossians chapter 3. Therefore, if we have been raised up with Christ, Colossians 3 and verse 1, therefore, if we have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above and not on the things that are on the earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then we will be revealed with him in glory. The focus of us, those of us, and by the way, when he says, if you have been raised up with Christ, just drop back in the context to chapter 2, and you find out that where we're raised up with Christ is when we were buried with him in baptism. When we were buried with him in baptism, verse 12, in which we were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. When we obey the gospel, when faith moves us to be buried with Christ in baptism, we rise to walk in newness of life. Our faith is not in the baptism, our faith is in the working of God, but we have to be baptized. That's where the salvation comes. And that's where we're raised up. And if we have been raised up with Christ, if that's really a genuine conversion that's been taking place, then keep seeking the things that are above. Let me tell you something. when people have gone through this process of becoming a Christian, we can tell whether or not they're authentic by what their focus is after they're raised up. And if my focus is more on temporal things than it is on spiritual things, that says something to me about where I am. The whole transformation process that that Paul is talking about here in Colossians 3 is predicated. We're trying to be conformed to the image of Christ, if you just read on down through Colossians 3. And to take on the characteristics and qualities of Christ, and we're to try to be renewed after his image. That renewal is based on the fact that our focus is not on this earth, but it's there. Listen, folks, if we don't keep this focus, if we let ourselves become distracted by the temporal, we will miss the eternal. And in missing the eternal, we will have missed everything. Folks, everything. We can't let something earthly derail us from what is the most important thing in life. And if that's been happening to me, I need to stop it. Because I don't have much time. James says this in James chapter 4, and in verse 14. Middle of the verse, he says, "You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away." Our lives are like that puff of warm air that comes out of our mouths on a cold winter day. It's white, and we can see it. It's obviously there. We can point to it. We can put our hand in it. But almost as quickly as we point to it, it's gone. And folks, that's what life is. Oh, I got 20 years to live. Maybe we did. You know how much time I've spent with this church? This August, it'll be 20 years. It's already gone by. When I was here 20 years ago, Harold was young. Younger, anyway. He's older now. I'm older now. And what fascinates me is, and what sort of is becoming more and more unsettling to me, is I've been preaching this thing about life is short, life is like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Suddenly, folks, I'm realizing it. I'm nearly 70 years old. I got 3 years to 70. I don't know how much longer I have, but I'm telling you what, it doesn't seem like a long time. It was just yesterday that I saw that beautiful woman coming down the aisle in her white dress. And we committed ourselves to each other to live with one another as husband and wife. And nearly 44 years, this June will be 44 years. Seems like that way. You know that my daughter is going to turn 40 in July? What I'm saying to you, folks, is that life is short. Life is short. We don't have time to get distracted by the things of the earth, by those things that are temporal. We cannot afford the luxury of carnal or temporal distractions that pull us away from the eternal and move us away from the eternal. We don't have time. It's time for us to wake up. There's a passage in Romans chapter 13 that I sometimes talk about. It's a passage that suggests do we know what time it is? Do you know what time it is? Here's what Paul says in Romans 13, beginning at verse 11. He says, "Do this," that is, love one another. That's what he's been talking about. Knowing the time. that it is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep, for now salvation is nearer to us than when we believe. The night is almost gone, the day is near. The night is almost gone, the day is near. Therefore, let us lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Do you realize that every moment we live, we're just that much closer to eternity? We don't have time to be involved in the deeds of darkness. We have time only to put on the armor of light. We sang about it. Let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provisions for the flesh in regards to its lust. We don't have time to give our attention to making it easy for the flesh to have its way. We got to spend our time more wisely. Spend our time focusing on the eternal, providing for that which is eternal rather than providing for that which is temporal. Please understand that we're running out of time. And I don't care how young you are, you're running out of time. What we have to do is we have to keep our focus on the eternal. Let's learn from the mistakes of the apostles. We can see how they so easily got caught up with the temporal that they ignored what was more eternally important. Let's recognize what time it is. I know that in recent weeks and months we've bumped up against death quite a bit here. We lost Margaret in February. We lost Janelle in March. My dad died in March. Greg has lost his sister in March. And on the day I arrived in South Africa to do my father's funeral, Candy told me that in our post office, or in our post box, arrived a sympathy card from our sister, Rosalie. If I'm thinking right, that was the day she passed. Listen to me, folks. These kind of things drive home to us the idea that life is short. Death is certain. Eternity is out there, and we will spend it somewhere. Let's keep our focus on the right thing. Let's not let ourselves get distracted by something temporal and end up losing our soul over. Let's help one another keep our focus on that which is eternal. That's one of the reasons we have a relationship with one another in the local church, so that we can provide that kind of encouragement with one another. Think about that.